Yeah. Sure. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this seminar by Dr. Nikita Sangwan. Nikita is a visiting assistant professor at ISI-Delhi.
Yes, वो तो एक्सपायर हो गया ना 2 साल पहले वाला था.
She very recently completed her PhD at ISI-Delhi, and her research interests are in the areas of labor economics, gender economics, environmental economics. And today she will be presenting her research paper titled Technological Changes, Social Norms, and Fertility Choices. So Nikita, you have about 45 to 50 minutes to talk about your work. If you want, you can take up clarificatory questions with me. But there will be about 20 to 25 minutes for detailed discussion after that. Thank you so much. I hope the mic is okay. Perfect. Okay. So thank you so much for the introduction, Harpreet, and for the invitation to be here. It's my first time in ISI-Delhi, and I must say you guys have a great practice. So making most for the great practice that you have. So before I start the presentation, I need to make sure that I'm clear to the requirements of different PhD categories that we have here in terms of the year that we're in. You can get a sense of how many of us are taking a PhD still in the coursework. Okay. And how many are people who are in the senior PhD categories? Yes. Who are the other side of people? Do we have master's students also? Yes. Highly motivated master's students. Now, thank you so much for joining today. So what I'm going to be talking about today is technological changes, social norms, and fertility choices. Okay. So the idea behind choosing this particular paper, which is currently in progress. So any comments, suggestions, doubts, please feel free to interrupt me during the flow of the presentation and ask your questions. We don't have to wait till the end of the presentation to clarify the doubts that you have. And in addition to that, if you have some big picture questions or some comments that you want to know discussion, probably those we can see further in the other presentation. So we can start with, the first thing, which is why this topic, right? So why is it that we were interested in looking at technological changes, social norms, and fertility choices? So we do know that there's a lot of impetus on technological changes, trying to understand how technology impacts different economic outcomes, right? Because it's a driver. But at the same time, the context in terms of which specific social norms might be binding or vital for the technological transformation to come around are very crucial. And during the presentation, that's what I'm going to be focusing on. But before that, I want to mention that this is joint work with Professor Heng Chiang at Shanghai University of Finance and Economics and
Sean Thakur at Indian Institute of Technology, Kanpur. All right, so let me delve into the motivation. Okay, because of the screen sharing, the titles of each slide is missing. Some of them are interesting, but that's okay. I'll read them out for you. Okay, so here is what really got us into this specific project. So we know that economies across the globe, developed as well as developing, are trying to push for technological change. And the reason for that is it does two very crucial things to the economy. One, it is able to generate new resources that are able to put an impetus on the existing trajectory that an economy is following. The second element is that we are able to make a better use of the existing resources, right? So if we think of a very simple input output function, you put in labor, you generate an output, right? So now if you are able to better use this input, which is labor, that leads to an improvement in terms of the output that you are able to generate. This is an enhancement of productivity. And this enhancement of productivity is what can be done by technological progress. But at the same time, what needs to be considered and taken with caution is all technological changes need not have only positive impacts. There might be some unintended consequences or unintended cost that might be associated with these technological changes. And it is one such unintended consequence that we will be focusing on. So what is it that we do know from existing literature is that there are papers coming from developed countries that have tried to look at the impact that technological changes have in terms of the labor market structure. But when it comes to developing country context, there is not much evidence. And it is this gap in the literature that this paper is sensitive. And the idea is to think of one specific type of technological progress, which is this technological shock or technological progress that we're looking at is green revolution technology. I think people in this room don't make a, like Anita or a refresher on what green revolution technology is. But we still do that. So we do look at what happens when green revolution technology was introduced and how it accentuated the existing male-biased sex ratio. So if you think of the sex ratios that are prevalent in the Indian context, they are heavily male-biased. What that means is that we have more men compared to women, compared to what would be naturally expected. And this is more of a developing country phenomenon compared to a developed country phenomenon. And since most of the literature which tries to understand this interaction between the technology and labor market structure and the family structure is coming from developed countries, they are not able to incorporate this specific type of norm that would lead to male-biased sex ratios. And that is precisely what we are trying to do in this study. So in this paper, we are using the Green Revolution experience as a lab setting. So Green Revolution introduction is taken as a technological progress. And then we see how it interacts with the social norm in the Indian context. And how it impacts the outcome, which is going to be the child-rearing decision made by families in India exposed to Green Revolution technology. And there are two elements to this decision, right? So one decision is just to think of how many kids do we want to have, which is going to be captured by the total fertility rate that we have. In addition to that, there's a question of what is the composition that we are looking at? How many boys and how many girls of the total fertility that is desired is what the family is planning for. In addition to this comes the element of quality. Because it's not just that you are thinking of having 5 kids but not educating them. You also have to simultaneously decide in terms of the number of children you want to have, the kind of education you are thinking of imparting to them, because that is also a cost-benefit analysis that parents have to do or couples have to do when they are deciding of the child-rearing decisions. And that is what we are going to focus on as we proceed through the slides today. In addition to this, coming from the policy element is the question of what can be done, right? So even if we find evidence that technology has an impact on these child-rearing decisions, we take a step forward ahead from that and try to explore which pension system can be helpful as a social security system in improving this worsening of sex ratio that can happen because of such technological changes. So just to set the background for the problem that we are looking at, which is the mean biased sex ratio. So if you look at the numbers from 1961, so we have 947 women per 1,000 males that were in the age group of 0 to 15 in rural India. By 2011, this number had worsened to 920. So we are missing 80 women per 1,000 men. And the question is whether green revolution can explain this change in the sex ratio. And as they say, a picture speaks 1,000 words. Here is the demonstration of what the census data shows in terms of the number of girls born per 1,000 boys born. So this is sex ratio at birth. And here, if you look at 1960, so we have about 950 girls per 1,000 boys. In 1970, we had a similar number, but while after 1970, in fact, 1965 was the year when the green revolution technology was introduced, and any technological introduction takes some time to populate to the changes, right? Because fertility choices are not going to be reflected immediately; they are going to be reflected with a lag. And with this motivational figure, we will see that between 1970 to 1980, there is a steep fall. This reduction represents a worsening of the sex ratio. Then again, we see even steeper fall from 1980. What happened in 1980? Anyone aware of anything related to fertility choices? There was a new technology introduced in 1980. Exactly. So as Bharti has rightly pointed this out, in 1980, ultrasound technology was introduced. It allows you to determine the sex of the child before the child is born, when it is in the fetus. And we will see that when we are able to determine the sex of the child, the sex ratio worsens at a faster pace. And in 2010, we were standing at close to 900 girls per 1,000 boys. So we were missing almost 100 girls per 1,000 boys. And this is a concerning figure. You do see that there are these coordinates at 1965 and 1980, which are two technologies that were introduced. So this is just motivation. There is no conversion here. This is just to motivate these trends. And the second motivation that I have here is in terms of the technology itself. So here we are plotting how many, so this is a proportion of the total area cultivated under high yielding varieties. So green revolution technology, what it really did was to bring in the high yielding variety. These high yielding variety seeds improve the productivity of two crops, majorly rice and wheat. So here what we are plotting is of the total area that is cropped, how much is cropped under high yielding variety. And we will see that it was introduced in 1960s onwards, and there is an increased uptake of the technology. So these two figures, in terms of looking at an increased uptake of the green revolution technology and the worsening of the sex ratio in the same timeline, is what this study is trying to understand. All right, so this is going back to the green revolution technology itself. So in the starting, I motivated the green revolution technology as having a labor market interaction. But the technology itself was land augmenting, not directly labor augmenting, right? Because it's improving the productivity of the land, because the yield of wheat and rice is going up. But since labor is tied to this land, so increase in the productivity, increase in demand for labor, it also led to an increase in the wages that the farmers in these areas were making. So in terms of the daily wage workers or the wage laborers, their earnings went up during this period, and that is what we are going to be using in the analysis.
But around the same that there was also increase in nature, so you have to keep
right. Right. So during the introduction of the green revolution technology, as Fertility pointed out, also came in mechanization, irrigation, and that happened because the green revolution technology in itself was a package, right? So it was part of the package that you are having higher yields coming up, so you are using machinery, and the part of the mechanization was also coming from the increase the wages, the wage rates, right? Because that led to an increased push in terms of the labor cost that farmers have to pay. So we are modeling this as a package of green revolution for technological problems.
Not just saying that education system per se, even there was increasing accreditation in a sense that would reduce the labor requirements, such as number of factors for land. So probably that saying that because there was an increase in need, therefore, and because it's a correlation per se, saying that because of that, the gender is causing partly it could be correct. I'm not saying that, but
Right. You're absolutely right there. So, see, mechanization is also an endogenous choice, right? So, when a new technology comes in that improves the yield, there is a greater demand for labor that is pushing up, bidding up the wage rates. At the same time, there is this cost benefit analysis that you are doing at the lab, thinking of whether to use the machinery or employ a labor. And when the cost of buying the machinery, is, it's not high enough compared to the wages that we're paying to labor, that's when we're going to get it. In addition to that, mechanization is not universal to all tasks of agriculture. Mechanization is mainly for preparation of land, that's where you're able to use tractors, and recently during the harvesting stage, you're able to use these harvesting machines. But for the other processes that happen between the preparation and the harvesting stage, mechanization, even till date, is not heavily used.
Not all the farmers can use tractors, because also they have backside. So the feature on this we have smaller backside, which is true for motor engine in India. You can't use tractors, there's a feature on that. So you would need magnet area. So if tractor is relevant, that is mechanization.
Thank you. All right. So now coming to what is this relationship or what is the economics behind this concept that we're looking at, right? So if the productivity of land is going up, there is a higher return to labor. So the wage rates are going up. In addition to this, the study by Sangwan and Schultz has documented that there is also a higher adoption by people who have certain levels of education, right? So people who have primary and upper level of education were more likely to adopt the technology compared to the ones who were not. Now, this is also correlational in the sense that people who at that time would have primary level of education also have better access to resources, right? Because they would be coming from the richer households with larger parcels of land. But that's what we are going to use in the conceptual framework and the modeling that we are going to do. That we introduce two things. One is a higher wage rates and a skill premium in terms of having schooling exposure. And then we're trying to see how does that sex ratio relates to these two things that happen because of the regeneration, right? So there will be multiple channels that will be driving this. The first channel is the income effect, right? So because of green revolution, the productivity is going up, the wage rates are going up, so the net earnings of the household are going up. What happens because of this positive income effect is that now you are able to support more children compared to what you were able to do without the green revolution. So just because of this pure income effect, you might see an increased fertility rate in the green revolution area compared to the non-green revolution area. But then there is also a substitution effect, right? Because if the earnings are going up, that is your opportunity cost of time. Raising children takes time. There is a time cost as well as an added education cost associated to rearing children. So as parents sitting today, you have to decide whether you want to supply whatever labor time is available to you in the market or use it in child rearing. And that's where this negative substitution effect would lead to having fewer children, right? Because when you're doing this cost benefit analysis of spending one more hour in the labor market and earning this higher wage rate, compared to spending that 1 more hour in child rearing activities, then you are reorganizing your choices. In addition to this, there is this quantity quality trade-off also, right? Because now you not only have to decide about the number of children you want to have, you also have to decide about the education because there is a skill framework associated with educating your children. So you are simultaneously deciding how many children you want to have, given the changes in the labor market in terms of the salaries that are available to you today, and also will be available to your children in the future when they are in the labor market, and decide on how much education you want to impart to them. So this is where the substitution effect becomes very dominant and also kicks in the quantity quality trade-off, which is a very standard framework. Finally comes the third and a very crucial element that we have modeled in this theory, which is the social norm of fertility. So when a parent or a couple is deciding on how many kids they have, the composition is very important, right? How many birds you want to have, how many birds you want to have. Thinking of the economics behind the being very important. What is happening is because of the Indian marriage market where there is the prevalence of fertility, where when the groom is married to the bride is to move to the groom's place, right? She is moving from the native place to her in-laws place. What happens because of this fertility is that she is not going to be able to economically contribute to the native house, but might contribute to the in-laws house. So when as a household sitting today, you are deciding how many girls and boys you want to have, you do see that having a son who is going to earn this higher wage rate tomorrow, you compare the son to a daughter who is not going to contribute. For having a daughter, there is no change in the return. In addition to that, you have to pay a dowry when you marry your daughter, right? So that's where the returns to having a son versus a daughter are not balanced, right? Clearly, there is an increased return to having a son compared to having a daughter as the technology is introduced. And then comes the question, these three channels, right? Is this specific to green revolution? Or is it going to apply to any technological change that will impact the wage rates in the labor market? So, that's the concern. Because here, the last setting we have used was a green revolution. Whether the impacts and the results that we will be discussing apply to any technological change or any shock to the labor market that changes the return for the boys compared to the girls.
So, when you talk about the green revolution technology, there's also a change in the cotton patterns that happen, right? So, if you look at the era of the 1960s and the 70s, wherein, if you look at things, let's say there was dominance of cross-like maize and cotton. And then, because of the HYEC varieties, there was more padding and substantial increase. And as you know, in most of the locations, it's the flooding that's required. And the way you go about cultivation of rice is that it requires transplantation, and then those saplings are brought into the field, spread out across. So I was just wondering that some of these tasks are also gender specific. So when you say that there is an increase in the growth rates, and you see that in fact dominant towards males, I was wondering whether you also see any increase in the growth rate for females, given that some of these tasks in terms of cultivation of these crops were specific to females. So, for instance, the transplantation would be done by women as compared to some more heavy-duty work being done by men. So, do you see that there was changes in returns because of the changes in the tasks that were allotted because of changing cropping patterns?
Right, so that's a very good point. So we do see that what is happening is most of the women, so women are very active players in these farming households. They supply a large part of the labor but to family farm. They are not working for paid work. So when they are doing transplanting, when they are engaging in different tasks, they are doing for the family farm or of the relatives. They are not doing it for wage, while men are mostly exactly. So as long as there's not this economic exchange that is engaged, it's where we are not able to capture that change. Because if you look at even today, right, so a large part of the labor for female in rural areas, they are actively participating in economic activities, which we include working in unpaid family work as an economic activity, but they are not doing paid farm activities. And this is a very important point because when we look at rice and wheat, right? So wheat is more male-dominated crop, but paddy, rice is a female-dominated crop in terms of the transplanting as well as the harvesting. But as long as women are not getting remuneration for it, that will not change these trade-offs. In addition to this, even if women work paid and if we were in a scenario, let's say in the integration context, where women do get paid for these activities, if petri locality holds there, we would still have the same trade-off. Because I, as a parent, would not include the return to my daughter working on my farm, but include that of my wife, right? So the trade-off between son and daughter still remains the same. And that's what is the focus of the study. So that does not change irrespective of, whichever scenario you consider.
The second part where you're saying what to be quality education children and culture. Between 1960 to 1980, 2 decades. Well, how much has a child enrollment in school? How much is the literacy rate?
Right.
For you to say that is a major factor that is driving student.
Right. So right now, I'll come to the education part. Right now, what we're looking is what are the possible channels that can have an impact. You're right, from 1960 to 80, there wasn't much variation. But from 80 onwards, as Self-Shiksha and other schemes started to develop, because we are looking at impact still today, till 2011 data. So what has happened from 1960s all the way to 2011, which is not today, but still that's the last data that we have available.
The chart that you showed show the big ones happening. Yeah, another big round in the 89. The 89 said that it because of the ultrasound, right? Between 60 to 80, only technology is going
Right.
and therefore the question is how much is the education will work?
Right. So with that figure, I am not saying it's because of ultrasound or gene evolution. I'm saying it could be. And that's what I'm going to test. At the same time, this is very important point that we do not see much education, a lot of education change, and when we calibrate the model, that's where we do introduce that premium associated of 20%, right? Coming from having primary schooling compared to not having primary schooling, which is again an estimate that we have borrowed from Rosen Light's paper, because they do see that there are differences in terms of education across billing and non-billing education areas. But at that time, the education level was literally 8 years, right? They were not going to colleges or schools. In fact, there weren't a lot of the senior secondary schools available at that time. So that's going to be one of the outcome variables that we look at, whether education changes or not. We don't have, we actually don't have. So this is why we are preempting what we do with the results, and we're not finding much change in terms of education. And that partly is because we probably have to consider more parts in terms of the levels of education. And we can actually look at the different ways and probably have a similar plot to the motivation figure. So that's a good suggestion. Thank you. Okay, so these 3 channels are clear, right? Because they are going to be at the core of what we are going to be looking at after this. So whatever that we have done and contributed to is first, I will show you the motivation to reduce from estimates. So that's the empirical work. Then I'm going to move to a model which is trying to have sequential work life cycle framework. So we incorporate, we recognize the sequential order in which the parents are deciding how many children to have and what composition of children they want to have. And within that framework, we have introduced the 2 institutions of model payment and petri locality of the match. So once we have this base model, we simulate introduction of green revolution, and we simulate the introduction of green revolution in 2 ways. One is a wage rate and the other is the scale premium. And then we run different counterfactual exercises from a policy perspective to understand the potential role and pension schemes can have in terms of gender imbalance. And the question of why we look at the counterfactual effect this pension scheme is really because children can be seen as, from an economic perspective, as a coverage for the old age, right? That's one potential way that parents have a son preference because the sons are going to support them in the old age. So we try to explore which providing an alternative to having sons, which is to have formal pension scheme, which can reduce the biasness in terms of the sex ratio. So, just giving you a quick snapshot of what the results are. We find that 1/3 of the change in sex ratio that we see from the 1961 to 2011 can be explained by the introduction of green revolution in the model. And we do take green revolution out of PhD, so we are not really splitting it across the seed versus irrigation versus the machinery. So it's the full package green revolution introduction that impacts the sex ratio. We will also look at, how stomach preference is varying across green and non-green revolution area. In green revolution, preference is higher. I'm sorry, is there a question? And finally, comes the policy implications. So what we find in terms of the policy implication is that both green and non-green revolution areas, sex ratios improve when they are exposed to the. So this is a hypothetical model framework. So we are able to have this counterfactual by introducing this pension scheme, and we see that they improve the sex ratio, but the improvement is higher in green revolution area compared to non-green revolution area. Okay, so in terms of what is the kind of literature that this work is really speaking to, right? So first and foremost, and I think everyone will agree on this, that we are looking at the gender consequences of technological changes. And in terms of some of the existing body of work, we do have a lot of support coming from different parts, developing as well as developed countries that have tried to document that the technological changes can have gender impacts. In fact, the first paper is one of my works with Professor Fazana Friedi, where we look at the gender impact of cloud shocks. And then we do find that the task-based division is playing a very crucial role. So we do have these evidences for different types of gender impacts, but when it comes to fertility choices or the long-standing issue of the worsening of sex ratio in the Indian context, we do not know much of how technological changes can impact these fertility decisions. Also, there are studies that have tried to look at how the high PG variety, which is the variation that we are using for the reduced farm estimates, can have an impact in terms of the infant mortality. In fact, we are going to borrow the measure used by Bharatwaj when we are estimating the reduced farm impact. Additionally, in terms of how social norms can impact the family structure in terms of biasing the male sex ratio. So the different questions that have been looked at have tried to use the son preference, which is an innate son preference. So they're trying to say that because son preference exists, that's why sex ratio is like this. There are also arguments around dowry payments, since you have to pay dowry for girls, that's why you see more preference for having boys compared to daughters. And of course, is the disadvantage of women in the labor market, since they have because of the existence of the gender wage gap, we don't want to have boys, we want to have boys because they have a higher earnings in the labor market. So these are some of the, I would say the determinants that have been looked at. But talking about this larger question of technological change itself, playing that there is a sense of worsening the sex ratios, that has not been explored, and it is that kind of literature that we have contributed in this study. And I will not go into the details of the policy contribution in terms of the pension scheme itself, because there is a large strand of macro research that has focused exclusively on pensions as social security systems in offsetting the damages or in terms of the investment for securing in terms of the old age. When these parents are old, so they will depend on the pension of the children. And that's the question that we ask, if pensions can help in reducing this existing son bias sex ratio. Alright, so now let me start with the estimation exercise. So the first part is the empirical exercise. And the empirical question is to understand what is the relationship between the introduction of the intervention technology and fertility choices and some preferred behaviors. And for some preferred behaviors, we look at two outcome variables. One is going to be the number of boys that you have related to the total children that you have. So which is the share of boys for each mother that she's having. And the second one is going to be a stubborn behavior, right? So one of the very common ways that Indian households practice some preference is by stubborn behavior. What stubborn behavior means is that, so you want to have one boy, so you conceive till you have the boy and then you stop. You don't have a child once you have the desired number of boys. So that's the probability that we will be looking at, how that changes when gene evolution is introduced. In terms of the empirical strategy that we have used for this, so we are going to be addressing the different outcome variables in terms of fertility and some preferred behavior or measure of green revolution. So the green revolution variable here varies at the district level and by the different year in which we are looking at the impact. We have lagged this by 1 year because fertility decisions generally are made in advance, they are not made instantaneously. So we are looking at the share of the total area cultivated that is cultivated under high yielding variety in district B in the year T-1 for a household that is making this decision in the TH period. And we control for a host of mother level characteristics as well as other household characteristics. We also have district fixed effect, year fixed effect, district year trends that we have controlled for in this specification. Because the introduction of the technology and the adoption of the technology depended on having access to certain facilities. And that would be captured in the district time fixed effect as well as the state specific time effects. So this is to just give you a sense of the descriptors in terms of the sample that we are looking at. So households in our sample have about 5 children. And of those, about 53% are boys, and 57% of these households are more likely to not conceive once they have a son. So this is coming from the NFHS data. So the data set had a retrospective history of all the women that were covered in 1999 cycle. And that's how we are able to construct this measure looking at the full history of women who have completed their fertility cycle. Here is what we have. So this is a first set of empirical results. And I'm sorry, but this is the only set of empirical results I'll show you today. So let's just take a look at what we have here. So we have the exposure to gene variation, which is the measure that I just described. And the first outcome variable here is the total number of children a mother has. So on average, so for the sample that we have all these different variables available for this, we are able to control for mother level characteristics and the fixed effect. Which number of children they have is about 4. Mothers who are exposed to gene revolution where they are making these fertility choices, they reduce fertility rates by 0.41 percentage points. Now, if what this tells us is that the input effect, the pure input effect is offset by the substitution effect that we were seeing in terms of reducing the fertility. What we also see is that when we look at the proportion of boys, there is an increase in terms of the share of boys in the total children that a mother is conceiving. So this is one of the indicators of an increased son preference that is being captured because of the introduction of gene variation. And the final measure is stopping at a boy. So the mothers who are exposed to green revolution are more likely to be stopping once they have a boy compared to the mothers who are not exposed to green revolution. So this is the motivating empirical evidence that we have that motivated us to go and build that sequential birth framework. Yes.
How exactly identifying the last variable crossing mechanism?
Right.
Just the first child you are like creating from the way or the third child. How exactly are they?
Right. So we are measuring stopping at a boy by looking at the indicators of the last boy. I can't. Okay.
Last four.
Yeah. So for example, you could have 2 kids. You are waiting for a third kid and it gives a son, you are stopping at it. That's the probability of stopping. So you calculate how many such scenarios are there where the mother stops at a boy compared to stopping at a daughter. So it's more likely that women exposed to green revolution, mothers exposed to green revolution, are stopping once they have a boy compared to stopping once they have a girl. So that's in the base, right? So the probability that you have a son as the last child compared to having a daughter as the last child. So for example, if there are 50 women, of those 20 are stopping once they have a son. So 20 over 50 is the like this measure is being captured.
That's some kind of positive.
It can be first child. So you just have the first child and you don't go for a second child. Absolutely. But since the average number of children that they're having is about 5, so you expect them more women to be having more than 1 child. The first child is very interesting aspect actually. So first child has been documented to be mostly exogenous. So it's 50% that it can be a son or a daughter. And that's continues in many studies as an exogenous variation to look at what happens to the household composition. If the first child happens to be a boy versus a daughter. So that's another thing for some of the recent, the fresh PhD journals that you might want to look at that variation. So now comes the level.
That's something so several other reasons, right? But also the mother's health at the time of last child. And whether she is able to conceive at all, and so on. I don't look for any of this when you say that is there.
Right. So that is very important because different mothers might be, especially given that they might have different fertility cycles, right? Some could be having the 3rd kid, some could be having the 4th kid. That is precisely why we introduce these mother-level characteristics. This includes the order as well as their different health measures that are captured in the National Family Health Survey. That's why the choice of this data is to be able to conclude from a lot of those characteristics. So, in some sense, we are looking at the cohort of women having similar characteristics, similar age, similar years of having been married, similar number of children they have had so far, similar also characteristics, and in similar times, just being exposed to different levels of exposure. And even in the construction of this measure, so since this measure is based on conceiving at that parity in terms of having the 2nd or the 3rd kid. So it's comparing mothers who are making that decision to be at that parity. We are not comparing your first child versus someone having a 3rd child. We are comparing someone having a 3rd child and a boy versus a girl. So that's what is really going in terms of estimating this impact that we have here.
The birth happening between 1960 and 80.
No, so this is, so we have this specific cohort of women. And what we did was we created this history, retrospective history of the women who were making fertility decisions between the 1960 to 1990. So because we are able to know when did they have a first child or second child, we look at mothers who have completed the fertility decisions during that time. And that's what gives us this exposure variation, right? Because of different years, they were having exposure to different levels of green revolution technology.
It's the reduction in total children.
The total children, it's purely a substitution effect, right? So because the technology is introduced, there is a high return to you working in the labor market, you want to have fewer kids. So this is purely a reduction of the total number of children that you want to have. Instead of having 5, now you want to have 4 kids.
But then you're also increasing the voice, so that means something to do with sex selection, right?
Right. So what is happening is you want to have fewer number of children. Within that fewer number of children, you want to have more girls. Or you want to have girls.
Of detecting the gender of the child, maybe the ultrasound story is also playing a role because you also have what's happening after 19. Maybe some interacting this with the time period that you put up.
Precisely. And we don't even need ultrasound to have this number, right? Even before ultrasound was introduced, there was a large amount of sex selection happening, right? If not an infant, if you look at non-fetal, it's not feticide, but it's infanticide. You just don't care for the grandchild, you get it taken care of. So it's prevalent even in that scenario, right? And that's why we have not had balanced sex ratios even before the introduction of the ultrasound technology. So it's both things that are at play. In fact, this is where Seema Jayachandran's paper becomes, a very good citation in the sense that what she has done in the Haryana state is she just looks at how changes in fertility changes the sex ratio, right? And she finds a negative relation. The fewer number of hits you have, the worse is going to be the sex ratio. And that is, that makes sense because you want to have at least one boy, right? You want to increase the proportion of boys, you're more likely to not conceive once you have a boy. What that is going to do is to reduce with one, the total fertility that you're going to have, and the number of daughters you're going to have. So there is going to be an uneven way or unit of getting the sex determined. Or even if the sex is not determined, then balancing this post the birth has been done. And that is precisely why when I come to the model, we model all of these choices of being natural, having a selection in terms of the son, or the model using the technology, not conceiving at all. Yeah.
It's just one question. Can it be the case that because of green revolution, we see that family income increase? And so, for sex selection, if you want to have access to that technology, one is illegal, so for you to be able to get access to that, you have to spend some amount of money which poorer households might not be able to afford. So it might be not just green revolution, but the economic growth in general. The economic growth has been higher in the areas that were more that were exposed to green revolution. It might just increase their income that is giving them access to the sex selection technology.
Right. So you just repeated what I said in the sense that it's not green revolution. Every such change can have these unintended consequences. And that's precisely the point we like to get home, and I'm very happy that you to the fact that any such change, right? So these households, if they have an innate self-defense, they want to have a son, you're giving them an income to that. So we have to be very careful of the concepts that we're talking about, right? So that's going to be at the core of the framework where we introduced an innate self-defense. So this is where we move from the empirical estimation to the model. And I will try my best to not go into the details and go into the query numbers and the solution of the question. But if there is any confusion at any slide or anything is not clear, please feel free to stop me and I'll be happy to repeat that. Alright, so what we are doing is to extend a very standard framework of the American life cycle model. And the way we are doing this extension is to not have a one-time decision in terms of what is the number of children I want to have, what's the composition I want to have. But rather have it in a more realistic setup where it's sequential, right? You have the first child, you need to know it's a son or daughter, and that's when you decide in terms of the decision whether you have a second child. If you do want to have a second child, do you want to use different technology to determine the sex of the child or not, right? That's what we have done to the framework. We have made it sequential so that we are able to exclusively make it more realistic. In this framework, we have men. So male agents will to be represented by M, female agents represented by F, a very standard notation. And the objective for getting this framework is to be able to study the future trade-off along with the gender proposition that will be determined. Needs to be able to look at the channels that we were talking about, right? The three channels. Empirically, you just have that reduced from number. We're not able to really tell how much is coming from income effect, how much is substitution effect, how much is specularity, right? Or we are not even able to talk about the pension schemes, right? We don't have a pension scheme in place. That's a hypothetical, thought process or an experiment that we're trying to do. All those things cannot be done with the reduced form analysis because of the data constraints that we have. But we are able to do this theoretically, and that's really the idea of bringing in this framework with analysis, which would have been a purely empirical analysis. Okay, so let's try to look at what is the advantage of using this analysis. So I'm going to start with first setting up the framework. So we talked about this decision of how to use the time. So in the model, we have given each agent 1 unit of time, and they have to optimally decide how much to supply to the labor market and how much to supply in for production and child rearing activities. We have assumed that a specialization by class, and that is coming from some of the evidence in terms of the summary stats that we have in women's engagement in paid work versus unpaid work. So we have modeled men as the ones who are participating in the labor market, and their labor supply is inelastic, which means that they have 1 minute of time they supply it to the labor market. And this is hardly coming from some of the other studies we have worked on, where we find one close to universal labor force participation of men, two, not a lot of engagement in home production by men. So that's what is really behind this, making this a simplified assumption, but at the same time, it does not have much impact, even if we were to make it a bit more elastic. The second thing is that we take labor market to be perfectly competitive. So all adult men who have similar level of human capital, they are going to be paid a similar wage. And women, since they are not participating in the paid work, they are going to contribute to home production. We are normalizing our economy, so the full macro picture to a unit of one. So male and female agents are represented by 1 unit. And we are going to be how, so I mentioned and really emphasize on the sequential nature. And this is where the sequential nature is very important. So the first fertility phase is where the period sequential nature of deciding how many children you want to have is going to be there. Once you have made that decision, the second decision is of the education you have to impart the children, right? So whether you want to invest in their education or not. Then comes the third stage where the kids are all educated. Now they are in a stage where the daughters are to be married and the son contributes to the household by working in the labor market. And then comes the last 2 periods, which are in the retirement period. So the pre-retirement period is the time when the parent, which is going to be the father or the male parent, is going to be contributing and will be supported by the children. And finally, the retirement or the terminal period when they die and they don't see any request and use of the they have earned. So now we're going to start with the first period, which is the most crucial part of this model, which is converted into 8 time periods, right? So 8 time periods are represented because we have almost 5 words. So we have taken 8 periods to allow for spacing between these fertility choices. And we take the gender of the first one to be random. So the first one child would be the daughter of the son, and 50% likely. So with 50% probability should be a daughter, and 50% probability should be a son. Later on, the choice is endogenous. And we take the states are going to be whatever effect you have accumulated in that time period, the number of children you have in that time period, and the composition of the children in that time period. And what these couples are optimizing on is choosing what is the best consumption, savings, and fertility choice they can make at that time period, given the different states. So the states are the fixed parameters that we have, and then we're making this choice. And we have 3 choices of natural selection, where there is 50% probability of having a son and a daughter. If we choose to compensate, then that period will be skipped, but there would be no change in the total fertility. And finally, there is selection where you can use technology to determine the sex of the child, and with 100% probability, you will choose to have a son or not. We are going to draw a taste preference, a taste chart, which are the side parameters, so that we are able to cover these different choices that these individuals have. This is a very slide. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but what I do want to emphasize on in this slide is, as a household, very simple version. You're trying to maximize a deterministic component and a stochastic component. Stochastic component is the place shot, because you want to cover a variety of different people having different sub-preferences. The deterministic component is the utility that you get from consumption of the consumption coming from whatever goods you consume as well as the production. There is a utility that you are modeled to be associated with going natural, right? Because there is no cost associated with you having to yourself or have a sex selection technology. And it is also no mental cost associated with choosing those methods compared to choosing natural method of child rearing. In addition to this, so this is going to be the future stream of utility we are going to get from the choices that you make in the future. So we are going to solve it now. We are going to solve it rapidly. Okay. So these are the three methods we have, and we will select from. And as I had mentioned, it will be natural, equally likely that you will have your fertility goes up by 1, but in terms of the number of new child that you have, can go up by 1, or it might not change if you have a dog. Similarly, if you choose to point this up, there is not going to be any change in terms of the total children that you have. There is not going to be any change in terms of the total sons that you have. And if you select, then what is going to happen is you are able to determine how many children that you want to have, and you are able to increase the number of sons that you want. So this is what the technology allows you to do. Okay, so now since we have different stages, this is the execution stage where you decide. Once you have decided those 8 periods solved iteratively, then you come to the education choice. And this is where you're deciding on how many years of education you want to impart to the son and the daughter. And so I'm going to continue with these slides because I don't want to go into the details, because I feel that what is relevant here was to be able to deliver the context in which we have done this modeling. And I would then want to come down to what results we have. So if anyone has any specific questions about the modeling or to understand better how with this kind of modeling, I am here tomorrow as well. Feel free to catch me, drop me an email, and we can fix the time. So for today, in view of time and in view of interest of people in the room, I'm going to be skipping over the modeling part that we have done here, because for each period we have done this modeling. So we have different optimizations that we are trying to maximize. So for example, here we are going to be solving for this, which is going to be the education level chosen from the male child and the female child, right? And there is a cost associated with having them different levels of education. At the same time, there is a return associated in terms of them getting a human capital formation that happens when you educate them. And this human capital formation for you matters only if it's a male child and not if it's a female child. Okay, so this is the third. Okay. Anyone in the audience who is interested in understanding those details, I will be very happy to. But what we want to come to is that what we did with equations. All we were able to do with all those complex equations was to come to a framework of what is going to be an optimal household solution, right? And from the equations you can see, we are told it's going to be a simple solution. This solution is very complex, and even MATLAB, it took really long time to come to an analytical solution. So that's why we are going to be using a discrete optimization. So where we have a grid solution, right? So we choose different values as a parameter, and then we try to optimize on how we are coming closest to the model that we have. So using all those model equations, we know what an economy would look like without green revolution. Then we introduce green revolution technology. And the green revolution technology is introduced in two forms. One is in terms of the unskilled labor higher wage rates, which is 35% higher. This is coming from other studies. So this is how you calibrate, right? So you use parameters from what other studies have established, or you do your own estimation. So we have total eight parameters. So some of them we have externally calibrated, wherein we just take it from existing literature. Two other parameters we have internally calibrated. So internal calibration means we have data available. We don't know what those numbers look like. So here is the two parameters that we internally calibrated. So kappa and alpha, which is innate log dollars. So what we do really is that we have these target moments, we have fertility rate from the data, we have sex ratio from the data. We have the framework of what the optimization exercise looks like. So we run this for the MATLAB where we are trying to use different values for kappa and alpha and trying to see which value brings us closest to what we observe in the data, which value is able to replicate what we have in terms of the data. So this is the data that we have, and this is what the model is predicting using these values. So this is how we internally calibrate different values for a model which we do not have available externally, right? The kappa here is the utility from using natural method of curve selection. And alpha with the innate log for waters. There is no measure available, and that's how you are able to really use these models to overcome some of the data constraints that you might experience in empirical work that you will be doing. Okay. So now coming to the final results from the model. So what is it that the model was able to tell us that we did not or were not able to say from the diffuse form analysis? So the first part is we first looked at what happens to total fertility. And the model is not doing a great job when it comes to explaining fertility rates. We don't see a lot of variation in terms of fertility because between green and non-green evolution areas, it's not changing much. It's staying at 6.7. What we do see is that sex ratios dropped from 947 females per 1,000 males to 938 per 1,000 males when the technology was introduced in the model. So you already know what all is going in the model, what is optimization done in the model. And once you have access to the technology, which is the green evolution technology, you do see that there is a reduction in terms of the sex ratio. And if you compare this to the data, this reduction coming purely from a very simple framework, wherein all we did was introduce the wage rate change and a scale premium. That's what is able to explain 1/3 of the variation. This goes back to the question. All we have done here is to introduce wage rates and scale premium. Any technology that you think of will do the same. So that means that all technological changes can have a similar unintended consequence. And that's really the kind of, the key takeaway that I want you people to have from today's presentation. Then comes the policy angle. So here, just focus on the top two, the lilac and the purple lines, right? So here what you see is this red one is the one without pensions, right? Because I was talking about pensions and what pensions can do. Now here you see some numbers, right? So these numbers represent what is the value of the pension. So if we look at one number represents here, if you are given a pension equivalent to the salary of an unskilled labor, then what happens to the sex ratio? So this is in the setup of before even introducing green revolution technology. And what you see here is if you are given the salary of an unskilled labor, then this is what the current sex ratio is, 948. the sex ratio would improve all the way to about 960 just by giving them a potential equivalent to human and skilled workers coming. So this is what the body is going to tell us in terms of the policy counterfactual. In addition, when we look at what happens in green revolution areas, we see a larger margin in terms of the improvement going all the way from about 933 to about 947. And this is when this level of generosity in terms of pension is offered. If you want to consider the scenario that if we offer a pension equivalent to twice the salary of an unskilled worker in the old days when these people are not on it, then the sex ratio is improving by a huge margin, right? So we are literally moving from 930 all the way to close to 960. So by 30 girls per $1,000, and that's a huge, huge number, right? So here, base are different because this is non-green revolution area. Yes, yeah.
16 and 9.8.
16.
And 9.8. And then we're starting off with 9.37. So that's 20,000.
So clearly, pension scheme works in both green and non-green areas, but it seems to have a larger impact in the non-green area, for the green revolution areas. And that makes sense because here is where people are more dependent on their sons, right? The returns to sons is higher, so there would be a higher impact when we give them pensions in the green revolution areas. And that's the conclusion slides. And the key conclusion I'm going to be understanding economic shocks can have these negative impacts. And that's why when you think of any policy or any kind of, I would say any kind of social security program, it's important to be considering one, the context in which these technology and the social security programs are going to be interplaying and how they're going to interact. And then think of how to really address the problem of the unintended consequences that these can have. With this, I conclude the presentation. Thank you. Sure. I'm happy to ask a question. Okay. So here you have the stochastic part, because if you want to think of optimizing a process, in real data, there might be only certain parts that if you observe, right? So you would see 5 children, 3 girls, 4 boys, 3 girls and 2 boys. But you might not be able to cover the full landscape in terms of covering the full grid. And that is why you introduce this stochastic preference parameter, so that you are able to look at people who have different kinds of preferences. So even if they were to have 5 kids, they will have a combination of 1, 4, 2, 3, 3, 2, and 4, 1, 0, 5, and 5, 0. So that allows us to have the full grid lottery. Because if you look at only the deterministic part, we don't know only the sample that we have in our data, right? Only those points will be incorporated. But we want to have these other preferences also incorporated, and that's precisely why the stochastic purpose is used. Yeah.
Do you consider, so there are families who will stock of the 2 daughters, and there will be families who will stock at 3 and 4. So do you consider all the families same? Because if you have a increasing number of daughters, then your expense also in taking care, caretaking kind of audience. So, I'm going to differentiate the family.
So the real reason that we have the sequential order is because we want to differentiate not only having 2 daughters and 1 son. We want to be able to differentiate the first daughter, then son, and then daughter from daughter, son, right? Because that also reflects preference, right? Or stopping at son or stopping at daughter. So that sequence matters, and that's why everywhere we care about the sequence, and that's why we brought the sequence in the model, right? Because when you decide, you're not just deciding, oh, you don't care about this. It's not that you're given a pill or pills, right? It's only step you decide, okay, once you are conceived, you know the sex of the child, whether you want to have a second child, what sex that you want to have, you want to go natural or you want to self-select, or what you really want to do matters in terms of the current state in which you're deciding. So the order and the clarity matters a lot.
Cost burden of are you considering it because I can understand from the specific how educated is quite right, and especially about the ladies and meaning is that is the labor class has very much to do with the category. So are you considering the balance with the others? If I have both children,
Right, absolutely. So, see, one, the decision as well as the cost are going to be dependent on the characteristics of the parents. When we run the regression, the reduced sum analysis with the data, we control for education of the mother and also the other resources in the household in terms of the NSS and the various indexes. In the framework that we have also introduced similar costs. Because there are two costs here. The one cost is this RC, which is in terms of the time cost. So depending on the number of children that you have, the education you give them, number of daughters you have, the education decision for them, you multiply with the cost of educating them. In addition to this, there is a time cost associated in raising the kid. So depending on the total children, the sons and daughters you have, 1 minus PC represents the time that goes in raising these children. So both of these costs are very important. They can be heterogeneous, and that's what we are talking about. Different people can have different costs, and that's what we will be able to check. So in terms of the counterfactors that we're running or the different statics that we're running, we can as well look at how changing PC or maybe RC changes the optimal choices that they're doing.
Okay. So the model that you are formulating, I think how is it using technology itself? I think the definition itself using waves itself is differentiating ultrasound from the
Okay, so if I understood this correctly, because coming to this is how we introduce the technology.
How does that have to do with introduction of the technology in ultrasound? Define the technology I understand it goes with the them.
Yes.
But given that there are two interventions in the time period of the inside this does not cannot differentiate and the differentiate clearly would be
Right. So if I were to model ultrasound technology, I would model it differently. I would not model it as change in wage or skill payment. I would model it as a reduction in the cost of self-selecting. Right?
Like Martha said, there could be some portion of the variation in sound from ultrasound also, given that we find a drastic difference in the slope, the decline. So how do you differentiate when you're confident or achieving? How do you differentiate the variation between you and
Right. We don't. And that's the point here, right? Because as you rightly pointed out, if I had to differentiate, I would have to model it differently. And since this framework does not incorporate a change in ultrasound technology, right? So what we have here is that people are able to select the sex, right? And if you are able to select the sex with one probability, that means you have access to an ultrasound technology or some other form of the technology. Because you are not using any time period, but still able to decide what is the sex of the child. right? That's how we incorporate. So we are not trying to differentiate, we are incorporating that framework in the setup of having green revolution technology into these.
We are interested in whether you use the ultrasound itself to determine. Basically, it could be whatever technology. So within those different arms that we want to solve, you're not really into whether you use ultrasound or not. You're not differentiating the technology itself. Mechanism might be different given the nature of the society. The just funny bring that here. It's further mechanism, which is regulated on the labor market of course changes. So it's the mechanism I believe how to find. So it's a full intervention in the life period.
Right.
So it's attributed to a technological intervention. Your sex ratio is right? Maybe two generalized talking about.
So she is actually talking about being able to really have the counterfactual of what happens if there is no sound versus having the sound. Right. So, see, the mechanisms are going to be different, but will impact sex ratio negatively. So, if I had to not think of this, just think of how changes. So that's that's something static that can be easily done by looking at how not having the option to select, which is not having the ultrasound technology versus having it changes this gap in terms of green and non-green revolution areas, right? But at the same time, as like this is another thing that even when we don't have ultrasound technology, people were selecting even before the technology was available. So
essentially, graph is the right. People time we can be interacted with.
So you're thinking from the digital perspective, right? So that should easily be done, right? Because mothers who are taking these fertility choices before as well as during the introduction of technology, because they could have made some choices before and some are making after. Some have completed the fertility choices completely before the introduction of technology, while some do it after the introduction of the technology. So it can be exactly. So it can be tested. What happens, right? Because that's deep. So that of course would explain sex ratio, right? But then the question is, that is something that we expect, right? That is very straightforward. So what's going to be the contribution, or how will we be able to maybe contribute in terms of the literature? Because we do know that ultrasound technology, that's precisely what it's going to do. It's going to watch the sex ratio. That's what having access to technology does. But is there something else to do with it, right? So probably it leads to an early termination of a pregnancy instead of having having the child and then having infanticide. So even those trade-offs are like that would be a separate paper altogether.
Fertility was not increasing much. It was 0.7 to 0.7, right? But the sex ratio was decreasing a lot. So is it that getting more about ultrasound and then we preference for boys and then I'm looking for something? Maybe that will be even the very small change in fertility, but big change. I'm just thinking that would be one possibility. And also that NFHS provide data on that category. So I just thinking about that in the labor class, like, on which category are you belonging, the kind of education, everything. So are you catching that in for or is there any relevance to that?
Right. So which class you belong to matters in terms of the decisions you're making. And that's captured in the mother characteristics, right? The occupation categories, all that goes in the mother characteristics. But in the framework, we currently don't have it, right? Because when you do any model, you want to use the simplest model to be able to come to the number that you want to estimate, right? The more complex you make it, the more you introduce heterogeneous variables. This model itself took us so long to solve. So I don't know if you thought we take another 2 to solve that failure. But that's really the idea. So be as parsimonious to be able to comment on whether the technology can have this impact or not. Then trying to fine tune it, introducing heterogeneous agents, right? So on the margin, you have to think of the cost benefit, right? In terms of how much time would go into it versus how much additional market contribution it would do in terms of the estimate. So we currently don't have that in the model, but we do have it in the empirical estimation. And to your point that we don't find fertility changes, right? And that's probably because the way we have modeled this framework is not able to address that. Probably there is something else that changed the fertility choice, and that, as you do point out, could be coming probably from ultrasound technology, right? And within ultrasound technology also, it's not guaranteed that fertility rates will not change, right? In fact, if you look at NFHS data, there are a lot of women who have actual fertility rates being higher than the desired fertility, right? So when you don't have access to the technology, you are going to have more kids because what is it that you can really do is you keep on having more kids till you reach the desired number of boys, right? Stopping behavior is that's why stopping behavior is one of the strategies that was being followed. And that leads to large family sizes, more than what the women or the mother would decide. So the minute you have technology, you should have a reduction in the fertility rates. One reason you might not see reduction in fertility rates is from the income effect, right? Now you can support larger families because of green revolution. So you don't really have to have fewer children, but you do care about having more sons. And that's probably what is happening in this framework because there is a pure income effect, right? You're earning higher. You are earning higher today, your children are earning higher tomorrow. So you think of that total increase in income as well. And that's why we're not adjusting on the fertility.
So I have a suggestion from future paper. I don't know whether it's been done already or not. So as you showed us, exposure to green revolution, gender differences in labor markets, and that in turn led to worsening of the situation. But what about afterwards? So has anyone shown that after the girl child was born, led to higher infant mortality rates of girl children in the world? You took less care of the girls than boys. What about schooling outcomes? Did girls drop out of schools sooner than boys in areas that were exposed to green revolution? So I'm now taking the story further along the road. Not just looking at before birth, but also after. I don't know whether it's been done already.
Right. I think that's a very interesting point because we are literally in Maharashtra. So there is a term called Nakusha. So Nakusha literally translates into unwanted daughter. And if you have an unwanted daughter, you are going to treat her in that manner, right? And that would reflect in the health outcomes, education outcomes, as well as, in terms of early marriage, as well as, the kind of treatment that you give to them. And some papers have looked at this, they have looked at how some preference coming from the NFF, they're able to capture the some preference using number of desired boys women report and then relate it to the health and education. So actually, Deshpande has a paper that has tried to look at this in the context of Maharashtra. They have done a survey and they have tried to look at what happens to these unwanted daughters, right? You wanted to have that son, you ended up having 4 daughters in the process of having that son. Now what happens to these 4 daughters, right? One, they have to share the resources. And it is very well documented that daughters generally are brought, they grow up in larger families. Because the stopping behavior that is having to share the pool of resources that is available. And that will bind more so in poor households, right? You already don't have sufficient resources, and then there are no mouths to feed, right? And that in itself, just because of being in these larger families, would impact these outcomes. And that's what they're trying to understand, that they control for the fertility and then look at what happens to treatment of a girl versus a boy child. And yes, this is a very important point because it's not at birth. It's not that it ends there. Even after that, it continues to persist.
Thanks.
I'm